Welcome everyone to Inside Asian Gaming's Trade Talk. My name is Ben Blaschke, Managing Editor of Inside Asian Gaming, and here today with Paul Newson. Paul is Principal at Senate, a leading specialist gambling law, regulatory and compliance advisory in Sydney, or in Australia, I should say. And of course, Paul is also the former Deputy Secretary responsible for gambling regulation in New South Wales up until July 2019. Paul, great to speak to you.
Thanks, Ben. Look, great to be here and look forward to speaking with you.
So, of course, it's been a big week for all of us here in New South Wales in particular, and certainly for Crown Resorts. The long-awaited Bergin Report dropped this week, and certainly pretty damning for Crown, most notably finding them at this stage unsuitable to hold a New South Wales casino licence. You've obviously had a bit of a chance, Paul, to look through the report. What do you see as the key takeaways of the Bergin Report?
Yeah, look, Ben, I have. I would just caveat that with I haven't had a studied look, but I've certainly looked to the key elements, the key findings, and the recommendations. It's quite a significant tome, and it was a significant undertaking, an exhausting inquiry, and I think to give that some definition, I was told it conducted more public hearings than the Financial Services Royal Commission. Now that's extraordinary. But it did surface a range of corporate governance and AML related shortcomings, there's no doubt. And it also formed adverse views around Crown's interactions and engagement with junket operators. Look, I don't think it's a bold statement to say that Crown's conduct fell well short of stakeholder expectations. That's not a bold statement. And I think its corporate governance performance has come under fair criticism. And I think some directors' performance in the inquiry itself left something to be desired. So I think it's fair to say that Crown has substantial work ahead of it to remedy these defects. They're not insignificant issues. But I think it's also fair to say that it's writ large that this can be redeemed. These shortcomings can readily be cured. And look, I think it's even helpful to pause and get some perspective. You turn your gaze, I mentioned the Financial Services Royal Commission, just to pause and understand the scale of the compliance failure, the wrongdoing and the toxic culture, and even criminality awash in financial services. And that gives me pause. That gives me pause and some perspective around this inquiry. So I don't mean, and I wouldn't diminish the shortcomings, but I do think, particularly in Australia, that the lens that we look at casinos through, the lens that we look at gambling through, is sometimes obscured and sometimes sensationalized by this outdated, this anachronistic view of the Vegas mob.
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul. I mean, the regulator has come out and made a few comments, obviously, the past few days about what they will do from now. They're obviously going to take a few weeks to go through the report in detail. They have to meet and consider exactly what they will do. Of course, the report is recommendations, nothing's set in stone yet. So what's the process look like here now for the regulator? What do they do from here, and what will their discussions be like?
Yeah, look, I think it is a complicated matter. Look, I reiterate, these things are readily capable of being redeemed. Crown's shortcomings can be cured. This is patently clear to me. I probably resist this popular narrative and jump to this, avoid jumping to this unsuitability finding. I think it's hard to sustain on the material that I've seen. I think it's difficult to sustain. The Commission definitely surfaced compliance failures and corporate governance failures and strategic missteps is perhaps how I would frame it. But this doesn't rise. This doesn't rise to willful. This doesn't rise to serious regulatory failures or misconduct. This doesn't reveal criminality. So, look, to my mind, there's a clear pathway to remedy these unsuitability concerns. And I think the chair of ILGA, the chair of the authority, has acknowledged that, which is heartening. And look, I think the chair, and there's some smart minds in ILGA, I think they'll earnestly be working towards working with the Crown board to get them on that remediation pathway and get them converted to suitability.
Sure. I mean, one of the key recommendations that really stood out in the report was, recommendation for the creation of a new regulatory body. I think it was the Independent Casino Commission or something along those lines. What are your thoughts on that recommendation?
Look. I think on balance, it's got merit. To the extent I've got a misgiving, it's really that from what I've immersed in so far, the report didn't adequately grasp the existing regulatory arrangements, and I don't think it necessarily recognises the cyclical nature of regulatory and governance arrangements in government or for regulators. There's certainly topical discussions at the moment about overhauling the corporations, the financial services regulator. So these things aren't confined to the gambling space. Look, my concern is, and this is where I'm heartened by this recommendation, is that the gambling regulation in New South Wales was shunted into the customer service department in 2019. All senior leadership exited. Look, somewhat dismayed at that decision and loss of capability. So, as much as the report shows some affection for the Singapore model, which not unsurprisingly is itself undergoing a massive consolidation and reform, because they're at the part of the cycle where they want a more coherent, they want a more holistic approach. So look, it's almost odd on one view that they're reverting to a holistic approach, and we're perhaps going back in time to a dedicated specialist approach. But look, I think it's encouraging. That's one of my key takeaways from it. Irrespective of whether you prefer a specialist dedicated regulator or you want a more generic capable regulator, reinvesting in gambling regulation in New South Wales is a very positive move. Where I do pause, where I am cautious, is the call for the powers of a standing royal commission. I think that might be overstating things. It's ultimately a matter for government to judge. It's ultimately a matter for Parliament to decide. But I would have expected to have seen the pages of the report reveal systemic corruption. I would have expected to have seen infiltration of organised crime, infiltration of serious criminality to support a recommendation like that.
That's interesting. Interesting angle, Paul. Of course, this has all happened around a company in Crown Resorts that hasn't even opened its New South Wales casino yet. There is a current operator, of course, Star Entertainment Group with the Star Sydney. What implications, if any, does the report have for Star?
Well, look, on one view, it's sort of striking that the Star didn't really feature in any significant way in the inquiry. Look, I understand. I mean, it certainly used to have similar junket arrangements. It's been the only casino with a footprint in New South Wales. It's had exclusivity up until recently in New South Wales. It remains the only casino operating. So look, I'm cautious about that. I think it might have been prudent for the inquiry to focus on the efficacy of the New South Wales regulatory arrangements, the efficacy of its performance, of its supervision of industry, of the Star. But the Star seemed to have a limited role. There was absolutely this forensic unpacking of Crown Melbourne, Crown Perth, and a reasonably shallow comparison with other jurisdictions, but Star didn't really feature. Having said that, absolutely there will be implications for the Star. You might cavil with the findings, you might cavil with the recommendations, but it's abundantly clear to me that this report, the findings, recommendations, and ultimately the government's response and the New South Wales Parliament's appetite to intervene is material for the gambling sector at large. So that's the Star, obviously Crown, but most gambling in New South Wales occurs outside casinos. There's around 1,500 gaming machines, slot machines at the Star Casino, obviously not including table games. There's some 90-odd thousand in clubs and pubs around New South Wales. So yeah, no, absolutely, this has significant implications for the industry.
Of course, for Crown as well, I mean, it was always envisioned as a VIP, a high roller casino, and relying quite heavily on international VIPs more so than domestic. Of course, now not only have we got this report and recommends that junkets are banned, but also there isn't any international travel at the moment, and Star has an exclusive agreement in terms of casinos on slot machines. So is there any regulatory scope for Crown to change its focus looking ahead, or is it looking at a bit of a bleak future in that regard?
Look, I think the recommendation, and I'm cautious about stating this, but I think the recommendation around junkets is somewhat hasty, somewhat absolute. I think it's looking through this lens, this anachronistic lens. These things can be cured. The regulatory oversight can be enhanced, and there can be far better cooperation between federal and state government and regulators to bolster the rigour of that oversight, if that's ultimately the policy decision. So look, I guess that's my caution. Crown can't have slots. Crown can't have gaming machines at the Barangaroo facility unless there's legislative intervention. Unless the New South Wales Parliament determines that it wants to introduce gaming machines into Barangaroo. And look, I think as much as they might be able to mount an argument for that, I think it's an argument for another day. I think let's have that debate once the suitability hurdle is overcome.
And I guess the last question and the key question really, Paul, is I mean, how likely is it that Crown can get to suitability?
Oh, look, I think it's abundantly clear the answer is yes. It's writ large. It's absolutely writ large. These things can be cured. These things can be remedied. I'm just not persuaded that an unsuitability finding is sustainable. And there's sharp minds at ILGA. There's sharp minds that they will be working with Crown to get them over the suitability hurdle.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for joining me and good to talk to you.
Likewise, Ben. Thanks for having me. Cheers.